Before we get too much further into this, sawing is as much about what you feel and hear as it is about what you see. Pay attention to what your hands and ears are telling you. If you're turning too quickly, for example, you'll feel it in how the blade binds up and the metal wants to lift on the upstroke. You'll feel it and hear it when your blade needs lubricant. You'll tell by the sound if you've got the right blade size. You'll know from your muscle aches or fatigue if you're doing something wrong. This is probably already feeling like sawing is a very complicated process, and it is somewhat, but the fact that you're taking in information from so many sources will actually make it easier for you to learn this important skill. No matter how well you learn to saw, you will still break blades. It's why they're sold by the dozen, and even by the gross. And when you do, it's frustrating, but the better you get, the smaller your pile of broken blades will become. If you feel like you're struggling, though, usually the problem is something basic and easy to fix. If you're struggling to pull the saw down through the metal, and when you get it moving, it suddenly lurches forward, taking a big uncontrollable bite, your blade is too big for the thickness of the metal. Go down a size. If it's very easy to pull the saw through the metal, but hard to feel like you're making good progress, your blade is too small for the thickness of the metal. Go up a size. When your blade is just the right size, it'll be fairly easy to pull the saw through the metal, and you'll make good progress. This is definitely one of the things that you'll be able to tell from the sound and the feel, as well as by looking.
And if you ever are sawing and every time you're pulling down, you're seeing the saw bounce. You see the saw is sort of bouncing on that blade. It's because the blade is too loose. There's not enough tension on the blade. And the blade is actually flexing and avoiding cutting the metal. So you need to put more tension on the blade in that case. That'll cut a lot more efficiently and you'll break fewer blades. So normally when you're loading a saw frame, you would just put it up here on this brass protector on the corner of the table and lean into the frame. If you find though when you're doing that you keep rolling backwards, hook your ankle onto the table leg so that you don't end up rolling backwards while you're trying to put tension on the frame. If you still can't get enough tension on your saw, stand up and use your body weight to lean down on it. Right. But you have to get enough compression of the saw frame so that when you tighten the blade up in that bottom chuck, you can pluck this with your fingernail and get a nice high ping.
Blades rarely last long enough to get dulled from use, because as you use them, they get stretched out from the flexing and tension. If the blade is curved or bent looking before you load it, it's toast. It'll most likely break as soon as you put pressure on it. If your metal keeps popping up off the bench pin on the upstroke of your saw, your blade is probably loaded upside down with the teeth pointing up. So it's trying to cut on the upstroke and pushing the metal away from the bench pin. Just take the blade out and turn it over.
If the chair is too tall, I'll tend to lean over and I'll tend to pull my hand back toward my body and angle the saw frame. Sit up straight, even if your chair is too tall. But even better, drop your chair down to the right height. Your shoulder should be in line with the bench pin if you're at the right height for this. That'll let you keep the saw frame straight up and down. Sometimes people also will tend to angle the saw frame because it feels right to them for the hand to be centered up under the frame, but it's totally wrong for the tool. The tool should hang off the back of the blade. So the blade is straight up and down.
If your cut is wandering, you're having a hard time following your line, but your blade seems like the right size, you may be overrunning your control, meaning that you're sawing faster than you can control through the cuts you're making. Slow down, use less forward pressure. Saw one stroke at a time. Speed is less important than control.
keep your thumb around the side of the handle. If you put your thumb back here, you're going to tend to push on the blade. You're going to be pushing the saw frame forward. And the saw frame, you don't want to push it forward, you want to let the saw blade do the work.
When you're cutting any kind of curve, your blade must be straight up and down. Tipping it will make the blade act as if it's much wider, causing it to bind up in the curve. Some binding is unavoidable and even useful, but not if you're losing control of the metal.
We keep it straight up and down. It's easy to turn.
Leaning the saw is never a good idea. The kerf is too narrow to allow for much lean before the blade binds up, and it is weaker side to side than front to back. If you're binding a lot, straighten up. Sawing rapidly with only the middle of the blade will cause you to tense your arm, pulling your hand back and tilting the frame. This will make you break more blades. Use full, long, easy strokes. If you're struggling and you've checked everything else and it still binds, check to make sure your bench pin is right side up. If your metal isn't well supported, the kerf will flex together as you cut and bind the blade. Also, the less wood under your bench pin, the harder it is to keep a firm grip on your metal as you cut. Move to a part of the bench pin that puts support close in to where you're cutting, and where there's more wood to get a grip on. Usually this is further forward on the bench pin, or on the saw hand side.
And we move our fingers so it's better supported.
If you're sawing especially thin metal, use the bench pin that has small slots in it instead, or put a piece of chipboard between your metal and the bench pin. Breaking a blade isn't the worst thing that can happen when you're sawing. Cutting yourself with one of these tiny blades hurts a lot. Luckily, it isn't easy to do, except when you're ending a cut. As you cut through the last bit of metal, the saw will suddenly lurch forward on the downstroke and into your finger if you're not careful. As you're about to finish a cut, move the edge of your metal right up to the wood of the bench pin and get your fingers out of the way, so the blade has nowhere to go as you break through.
Sometimes you'll be sawing along and it gets real easy to go up and down, but you start making no forward progress and you don't hear the saw biting into the metal anymore. It's because you're sawing into the bench pin. All right? Every now and then as you're sawing along, you'll have to move the metal further back from the pin to make some room.
Muscle fatigue in your sawing hand usually indicates that you're doing something wrong. Check your blade size, and more importantly, check your grip.
Forefinger. These fingers keep them loose. Right? Saw frame floats up and down. Okay?
Mm-hmm.
Not this. Right? And not this, which is going to push the saw frame forward.
And sometimes the problem is the saw itself. Make sure you're tightening the chuck sufficiently to grip the blade, and that you're loading the blade in the full length of both chucks to make it easier to get a good grip. If they're still slipping out of the chucks, check the chucks. Both the fixed and movable side of the chuck have a rounded end. Make sure that the movable side hasn't gotten rotated around. The inside of the chucks have a linear texture to help grip the blade, and if they get rotated around, they don't work. Also, sometimes they just get worn out and need to be replaced. Let me know if you think that's the case, and I'll get you replacement parts.